Welcome to Democracy Undecided. We are not afraid of uncomfortable questions: what democracy looks like in real life, which forms it take, and where exactly those forms lead their citizens to safety and prosperity, or to fear, poverty, and a sense of no way out. In the first episodes, we traced how democracies and justice systems developed over time. Then we took a close look at the Swiss model to see the cause and effect links between the structure of power, how the executive and legislative branches work, how the courts function, and how all of that plays out in the economy and in people's everyday security. We showed how elections actually work, how political forces are selected, what their decisions do to the economy, and what kind of real protection citizens receive. Today, we take another step forward and ask, what may be the sharpest question so far? Can a democracy without poverty exist at all? Or is that still just a utopia for economic philosopher dreamers? A dream that never moves from paper to practice. In our view, any democracy with a market economy faces three basic and most pressing questions. First, is this economy, in principle, capable of producing enough food to feed all of its people? Second, if the country objectively produces enough food, does there still exist a systematic, long-term problem of hunger and poverty among certain group of people? People who live for years on the edge of survival and regularly don't get enough to eat. Third, and the most painful, if this hunger and poverty do exist, which politicians are actually responsible for that? Why can't they or don't they want to change the situation? And why do we, as citizens, keep electing again and again people who are not able to deal with such basic problems professionally and effectively, and finally eliminate the most primitive deficit of food? Maybe their true priorities lie somewhere else entirely. And then it's time to ask an honest question. Shouldn't the fight against hunger and poverty be one of the core responsibilities of any politician elected by the people? Let's start with a simple admission. If we, as a society, have accepted the market economy, then we have also accepted market competition. And in any competition, there will always be those who come first, those who end up in the middle, and those who finish last. In physics, in a closed system, the amount of energy is constant. It doesn't appear out of nowhere and doesn't disappear. It just moves from one state to another. If you transfer this logic to the economy and imagine it as a closed system, then at any given moment, the total amount of available resources can be treated as fixed. It's not infinite. It is simply distributed in different proportions between the participants in this competition. Over time, of course, we can expand total amount of resources. But at any specific point in time, the pie is finite, and what one person or group receives inevitably affects how much is left for everyone else. To make this as clear as possible, let's walk through a very simple example together. Imagine a closed economy consisting of just two families. That's the entire system. In the first family, the man catches 2 fish every day. In the second family, the man digs up 2 potatoes every day. Fish and potatoes in our simplified model are equal in calories and in the time and effort required to produce them. In terms of labor and energy, they are equivalent foods, or goods. For both families to survive and eat a varied diet, they need to trade. So we face a simple question: what does a fair barter look like? If they exchange 1 fish for 1 potato, we can call that a fair deal. Each family gives away as much value as it receives. People work roughly at a break-even level, no surplus, no loss. The amount of work they put in is reflected back to them through the exchange or trade. Now, let's slightly change the rules. Suppose for some reason they agree to trade half a fish for one potato. Formally, the exchange is still voluntarily, but in a substance, something very different is happening. The fish family gets more value per unit of their labor, while the potato family gets less, even though both men work the same amount of time and with the same effort. Over time, one family starts to accumulate surplus, strengthen its position, and build up capital, while the other lives permanently on the edge, lacking resources even though they keep working just as hard. The lesson from this simple example is crucial. Even in a system with only two participants, you can, without any violence and simply by changing the terms of exchange, create unfair trade and stable inequality, and at the same time build excess capital for future use. This is exactly the logic that then scales up to real economies with millions of participants. In economic terms, the first situation is close to ideal competition, perfect competition. The participants are symmetric, the labor is comparable, the one fish for one potato. Exchange reflects a fair ratio of the efforts invested, and neither side can push the other around. In the second situation, half a fish for one potato, we no longer have a free and fair competition. We have a skewed market in which one side has gained the power to impose its own terms of exchange. Formally, the trade remains voluntarily, but in the reality, we see market power on one side and a systematic transfer of extra resources from one family to the other. Even in this toy model, we see that a small shift in the rules of exchange is enough to replace fair competition with stable injustice and inequality. That is the basic logic of capital accumulation, creating surplus by rewriting the terms of exchange in favor of the stronger side. An open market economy carries within it a huge number of built-in distortions, both historical and current. That is the key reason why the distribution of capital becomes more and more unequal over time. Now let's move from our two-family thought experiment to the real economy. If you look at the economy as a competition, we again have to stress there will always be winners, those in the middle and those who lose. But in reality, instead of two families, we have millions of people and thousands of companies. Unfair exchange arises not just because of the exchange rate, but because of a whole set of factors. Information asymmetry, monopolies and oligopolies, the enormous bargaining power of capital versus an individual worker, complex financial schemes, and legal structures that a regular person simply cannot realistically understand. On top of that comes what we might call social Brownian motion, the random trajectories of individual lives of regular citizens within social structures. But it is important to understand that for those in power, there is no random motion. For their heirs, life trajectories are planned in advance so that they stay close to power and wealth. At the same time, society idealizes the rich and celebrities, but rarely celebrates scientists, engineers, teachers, bricklayers, or electricians. And a blunt question follows from this. If a large share of real-world exchanges are effectively arranged according to the half a fish for one potato scheme, can we honestly keep calling this system a free market and fair competition? The labor market is the second key lever of resource distribution in any market economy. When there is a structural shortage of decent jobs, when there are fewer good, reasonably paid, humane jobs than there are people, a simple dynamic emerges. People stop fighting for fair wages and decent conditions. Instead, they fight for the right to have a job at all, anywhere. Control over the population in such a system is not exercised mainly through bans and batons, but through the constant threat of unemployment. If I lose this job, I might not find another one for months or even years. That fear alone is enough to make people accept low pay, unpaid overtime, toxic management, and the absence of social protections. As a result, a growing share of profits and resources is captured by the owners of capital and top management, while some people cannot find work at all and live for years in a zone of systematic poverty. Formally, they still have the right to vote, but in practice, fear of poverty and job scarcity dictates the rule of the game to them, directly or indirectly. Here, the contrast with Switzerland is very revealing. There, the chronic deficit is not jobs, but workers. Employers are forced to compete for employees, not the other way around. In one case, a democracy with a market economy rests on the fear of losing your only source of income, while in the other, the system is built so that honest work almost always finds a place. Against that backdrop, a direct question arises. How democratic can a system really be if the majority is governed through the constant threat of unemployment and poverty? And yet, despite all these distortions, unfair exchanges, and rule by fear, a market economy has a major positive feature. Within such a system, private entrepreneurs really can create and do create goods and services that expand the overall wealth of society. Even when resources are divided unequally, the pie itself grows over time, new technologies emerge, productivity increases, and the volume of goods and services produced rises. The problem is not that the market economy cannot create wealth. The problem is how that wealth is divided. From here, we can draw an intermediate conclusion. Today, the world, and especially developed democracies, is already productive enough that no one should have to live in poverty, and certainly not in hunger. But unfair exchanges, like our fish and potato example, ruling through the fear of losing one's job, and a set of political decisions designed to systematically protect the strongest side, all turn poverty into a normal, built-in function of the system rather than the personal fault of the poor. If the problem lies in the rules of the game themselves, and not in laziness or inferiority of individual people, then another simple question follows. Can those rules be rewritten in such a way that poverty simply disappears? According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the world today produces enough food to feed the entire global population. On average, that's about 3,000 kilocalories per person per day, while a normal human need is roughly 1,800 to 2,200 kilocalories. In other words, at the global level, we already have not a shortage of food, but a surplus. The problem is not that there is too little food, it's how the food is distributed and who actually has access to it. In a wealthy European democracy with strong social systems, this is particularly clear. In countries such as Slovenia, Switzerland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, France, Austria, and Belgium, there is no shortage of food. The calories and products available per person exceed what is needed, and a significant part of that food is simply thrown away. In Slovenia, for example, the proportion of people experiencing severe food insecurity, meaning they already have to skip meals because they don't have the money, is estimated at around 0% at certain times to 0.7% at another times. In Switzerland, it's roughly from 0 to 0.7. In Norway, Belgium, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Austria, around 1 to 2% of the population are in that situation, according to various estimates. There are still hundreds of thousands of people, but in percentage terms, this is very low compared to much of the rest of the world. Food exists, the economies are rich, and the social redistribution mechanism work well enough that open, chronic hunger becomes a rare exception rather than a normal part of life. A very different picture emerges in a group of rich democracies outside continental Europe, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. By income per capita and by the volume of food they produce and import, these countries are richer than the most of the world. They also produce and import more food than their population strictly need. And yet, every year, they throw away millions of tons of perfectly eatable products. In practice, however, about 1 in 6 households in the US experience food insecurity. In the UK, various estimates suggest that 10 to 15% of households live in a state of food insecurity. In Canada, it's around 18% of households. In Australia, studies show between 13 and more than 30% of households facing serious problems with access to food at some point during the year. In New Zealand, roughly a quarter of children live in families where food often or sometimes runs out. Remember that these are countries that operate under common law, while the European examples mentioned earlier are civil law systems. Objectively, these states are fully capable of feeding everyone, yet a substantial portion of their populations regularly undereat or eat significantly worse than they could, not because the food doesn't exist, but because of how the labor market is structured, what wage levels look like, how expensive housing is, and how their social support system work. And this again brings us back to the central point. Poverty and hunger in the modern world are no longer about the physical shortage of food. They're a result of political and economic rules of the game. If all these examples and discussions make it clear that poverty and hunger arise not from a lack of food or overall wealth, but from how the rules are set up, a series of uncomfortable questions follows. If the rules are the problem, can they be rewritten so that the poverty disappears altogether? Would that be beneficial for the society as a whole, not only for the poorest? And most importantly, has anyone already tried such reforms in the real world rather than just having theoretical discussions? Many years ago, I read Rutger Bregman's book Utopia for Realists, in which he describes a real-world attempts to answer exactly these questions through pilot projects of guaranteed income or so-called minimum income experiments in Canada and the United States, and reconsideration of the state's role in rich democracies. Rutger Bregman is a Dutch historian and public intellectual. His Utopia for Realists is not about wishful dreaming, but about institutional change. He asks whether we can structure the economy in such a way that poverty as a social class effectively disappears, given that the resources already exist, and propose to rebuild the rules of wealth distribution in modern democracies accordingly. In further discussion, we will walk through which ideas he puts forward, what real experiments have already been conducted, and why, despite positive results, most democracies still cling to the old rules. If you strip it down to the core, Bregman offers not a comforting fairy tale, but a set of specific tools which, in our efficient potato model, change both rules of exchange and the rules of the labor market. The first idea is a guaranteed minimum income or unconditional basic income. Its role is to remove the basic animal fear of being left with nothing. If the baseline of survival is guaranteed, our fisherman and potato grower are no longer forced to accept half a fish for one potato, just to avoid starvation. They regain bargaining power. The person can say, "I will not work under these conditions," and that statement starts to carry real weight. The second idea is a shorter working week. If labor productivity is already very high, there is no good reason to maintain a permanent shortage of decent jobs. Work can be shared more evenly, reducing structural unemployment. There are fewer people who are desperate enough to take any job on any terms, the harder it becomes to buy their labor on the half a fish for one potato terms. The third idea is a fairer global system, from migration policy to international trade rules. Bregman stresses that unequal exchange happens not only within countries but also between them. Poorer regions often play the same role as our underpaid potato family, providing raw materials and cheap labor, while rich countries capture most of the added value. The fourth idea is investment in human capital and social guarantees. Education, healthcare, at least basic housing. The aim is to level out starting conditions so that a person's success depends less on sheer social Brownian motion, random strokes of luck and misfortune, and more on their actual efforts and opportunities. Taken together, these ideas are not about abolishing the market. They are about rewriting the rules so that fair exchange and basic protection from poverty become the norm, rather than a utopian fantasy. Bregman relies not only on theory, but on concrete experiments. One of the best known is Minkan in Canadian province of Manitoba, conducted in the 1970s. Residents of a small town were guaranteed a minimum income. If a family's earning fell below a certain level, the state simply paid the difference. Politicians' main fear was straightforward: everyone will stop working. But when the researchers went back to the data years later, they found that mass withdrawal from work never happened. Only young mothers and teenagers slightly reduced their working hours. The mothers to spend more time with their kids, the teenagers to stay in school longer. At the same time, another effect became visible. People began to move out of survival mode. They gained the ability to save money, invest in their education, start small businesses, and quit toxic jobs instead of clinging to them at any cost. The pressure on healthcare dropped, fewer hospitalizations, fewer visits related to mental health. In areas covered by the program, crime fell, families became more stable, and children stayed in schools longer. A similar approach was used in the United States in experiments with so-called negative income tax, where the state does not take money from the poor but instead tops up their income to a minimum level. The outcomes were similar. People did not turn into lazy freeloaders, as critics like to warn. Instead, they gained a chance to stabilize their lives, improve their health, extend their education, and change jobs rather than abandon work altogether. Despite positive results, these programs never turned into full-scale reform. Political backlash, fear of an overgrown state, and pressure from those who benefit from the status quo buried many of these initiatives. Bregman also cites modern basic income pilots in various countries and cities, which again and again show the same pattern. Giving people a bit more security does not destroy their motivation to work, but significantly reduces poverty, improves health, and cuts stress and crime. This is no longer just theory. The world has repeatedly tested new rules of the game, and the results suggested that when people are not living in constant fear of losing everything, they tend to use their freedom not to fall apart, but to build more stable and productive lives. So, if basic income produces such results, why hasn't Utopia for Realists become the norm, at least in the richest democracies? This is exactly where the democracy itself starts to crack. Keeping the current rules of distribution is clearly beneficial to specific groups, segments of business and political elites, and entire industries that rely on cheap labor and the constant fear of unemployment. If people are afraid of losing their jobs and being left without money, they are much easier to control and manipulate. You can sell them almost any wage and any working conditions. Then the media step in. Basic income is demonized as a scheme for lazy parasites. We are told that no one will work if people are given even minimum financial freedom. Conversations about systematic poverty are replaced with talk about personal responsibility and proper motivation. Technical arguments, public debt, inflation, taxes are often used not as tools of honest economic analysis, but as political weapons to scare voters. If you give more to the poor, everything will collapse. Formally, democratic states have the institutions and resources to implement these reforms. But through media, narratives, lobbying, and carefully cultivated atmosphere of fear, People are constantly pushed directly or indirectly to vote against their own long-term interests and in favor of preserving old rules that serve a minority. If you look at all this through Bregman's lens and bring Switzerland back into the frame, we see another key difference. But before we dive into it, let's consider a few aspects first. In any modern economy, there are three main players: businesses, the state, and the citizens. Businesses naturally seek to maximize profit. Citizens seek security and a decent life. The state's role in a healthy democracy is to smooth out distortions between the interest of capital and the interest of people, through taxes, social programs, labor laws, and regulation of monopolies. Bregman's logic of basic income and social guarantees effectively calls for strengthening this third side, so that it can protect society from half a fish for a potato arrangements. Switzerland is not a perfect but a functioning version of this balance. There is a chronic shortage of workers rather than jobs. Strong trade unions and collective bargaining system prevent employers from endlessly pushing wages down. And through referendums and direct democracy, citizens regularly intervene in decisions about resource distribution, from taxation to pension reforms. Yet, even when you look specifically at wealth distribution, Switzerland remains one of the richest countries in the world, both in terms of income and accumulated capital per person. The state, backed by active citizens, really does act as an arbiter between major market players and ordinary people, preventing extreme distortions. In most other rich democracies, this triangle is quite deformed. Businesses and parts of the political elite often act as a single bloc, while the state increasingly abandons its balancing role. That is why ideas similar to Utopia for Realists remains isolated experiments rather than standard policy. Seen through Bregman's eyes, Switzerland is not a utopia for realists, but it is one of the closest real-world approximations. It has a very low level of poverty. The right to a decent life is embedded in law. Social guarantees are strong. The country has a shortage of workers rather than jobs, and then the baseline level of security is high. At the same time, Switzerland does not have a full unconditional basic income. Wealth inequality remains pronounced, the cost of living is extremely high, the rules of the game are still far from ideal. So we can call Switzerland a democracy that has proven it can compress poverty dramatically, but has not yet decided to go all the way along the path implied by Utopia for Realists. If we zoom out, it becomes clear that no country today has achieved a perfect Utopia for Realists. In some respects, the Scandinavian democracies, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, are closer to this ideal. Their income inequality is lower, their social safety nets are strong, levels of trust are high, and education and healthcare are genuinely accessible to the majority. The Netherlands, Bregman's home country, has also built a strong social state model, robust support for families, housing, part-time work, and a relatively flexible labor market. Against this backdrop, Switzerland stands out for a different package of qualities: extremely high wealth per capita, very low poverty, a shortage of workers rather than jobs, and direct democracy tools that allow citizens to directly influence how resources are allocated. The most honest way to put it is this: different countries approach a utopia for realists in different ways. Some through broader redistribution, others through fairer market rules and strong bottom-up democracy, but none of them has yet reached a point where poverty as a class has truly disappeared. Many democracies and their politicians are simply neglecting poverty and hunger as social problem, one way or another. There is another straightforward but uncomfortable question. Who actually pays for all these social programs in developed democracies? Who really finances the state budget? If we look at the structure of tax revenues in OECD countries, we see that, on average, about half of all government revenues come from taxes and contributions paid by ordinary people. personal income taxes and payments into social and pension insurance systems. Roughly another quarter comes from consumption taxes or value-added taxes, and excise duties that we pay every time we buy goods and services. Only about 10%, sometimes slightly more, comes from corporate profit taxes. In Switzerland, as in most rich democracies, the pattern is very similar. The combined contribution of households through income taxes, social contributions, and consumption is much larger than the contribution of businesses. If we strip away political rhetoric, it becomes obvious that the lion's share of funding for social programs and redistribution comes not from some abstract rich corporations, but from the working middle class. They're the ones who keep the system running, and at the same time, they themselves need the rules of the game to be fair. And now comes the most uncomfortable but honest turn. What does all this look like in your country? In your real life, is the exchange closer to a fair one fish for one potato, or to half a fish for one potato, just wrapped in a nice language about the free market and competition? Where exactly are the distortions hiding in your situation? In wages, in housing prices, in debt, in taxes, in access to education and healthcare? And are you willing to support reforms that remove the constant fear of poverty and give people basic freedom? Even if you are told every day that it is impossible, this is utopia, and everything will collapse. Share your thoughts in the comments. In the description under this video, you will find links to the sources we used and official statistics, so that each of you can check the data independently and draw your own conclusions. Use these links, stay critical, stay informed, and keep learning. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this episode. If you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this episode with those who care about democracy and poverty. In the next episodes, we will continue this line and look at the crime levels in different countries as a consequence of distortions in democratic systems, how the media shape our perception of poverty and the deservedness of wealth, how labor markets are used to control people, and how different democratic models in the real world move us either closer to a utopia for realists or towards its complete opposite. If you want to understand who in your country is really getting 1.5 fish for one potato, stay with us. See you in the next episode.